Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 1. Mrs. Lynde is Surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived on the main road in Avonlea, a town on Prince Edward Island off the coast of Canada. Anybody who was coming to or leaving Avonlea had to use the main road and pass by the Lyndes' house. Mrs. Lynde was always watching from her kitchen window. Mrs. Lynde sat at her window one afternoon in early June. At 3:30, Matthew Cuthbert was driving his buggy down the road. He wore his best suit. Matthew should be planting turnip seeds now, like Mr. Lynde, thought Mrs. Lynde. But instead, he is in his buggy and dressed in his best suit. Where is Matthew Cuthbert going, and why? If it was any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Lynde might be able to guess where he was going. But Matthew Cuthbert so rarely left home that it had to be something unusual. He was the shyest man alive and hated to go anywhere he might have to talk. "I'll just go to Green Gables and ask his sister Marilla where he's gone," she decided. After hearing, "Come in," from Marilla, Mrs. Lynde stepped into the kitchen. She looked carefully at everything on the table. There were 3 plates, so Marilla must have been expecting a visitor to come home with Matthew. But the dishes were everyday dishes, and the cake was plain, so the expected visitor could not be anybody too important. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla greeted Mrs. Lynde. "This is a lovely evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are you?" Marilla was tall and thin. Even though she looked stern, she did have a sense of humor. "We're well," said Mrs. Lynde. "Though I thought you weren't well when I saw Matthew in the buggy today." Marilla had expected Mrs. Lynde to visit because Mrs. Lynde was a curious person. "Matthew went to Bright River," Marilla said. "We're getting a little boy from an orphanage, and he's coming on the train tonight." If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Lynde could not be more surprised. She actually stopped talking for 5 seconds. "Why on earth would you do that?" she asked disapprovingly. "We've been thinking about it for some time, all winter in fact," replied Marilla. "Matthew is growing older. He's 60, and his heart is not so good. It's difficult to hire someone to do farm work." Mrs. Lynde always said what she thought. In this case it was, "Well, Marilla, I think you're doing a very foolish thing. You're bringing a strange child into your house and you don't know a thing about him. Last week in the newspaper, it said that a family took an orphan boy and he set fire to the house at night, on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them in their beds." Marilla was neither offended nor alarmed. Meanwhile, Matthew Cuthbert and the horse jogged the 10 kilometers to the station. It was a pretty road, and the air was sweet with the smell of apple and plum blossoms. When Matthew arrived, there was no train, and he thought he was early. The long platform was almost deserted, except for a girl sitting at the end. Matthew walked quickly past her to the station office. "The 5:30 train is gone, but there was a passenger for you, a little girl," said the station master. "I'm not expecting a girl," said Matthew, surprised. "It's a boy I've come for." The station master raised his eyebrows. "Well, I guess there's some mistake. Mrs. Spencer came off the train with that girl. She said you and your sister Marilla were adopting the girl from an orphanage." The girl watched Matthew. She was 11 years old and dressed in a very old and very ugly dress. On her head was a worn-out brown hat. Under the hat were 2 braids of very thick, very red hair. Her face was small, white, and thin, and she had many freckles. "I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables?" she said in a clear, sweet voice. She held out her hand. "I'm very glad to see you. I was afraid you weren't coming for me. I had decided if you didn't come for me, I'd climb up that big wild cherry tree. It would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree under the moon, don't you think?" Matthew shook the little hand awkwardly and wondered what to say. Matthew could not say there was a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla explain everything. "I'm sorry I was late," he said shyly. "Come along. The horse is over in the yard." "Oh, I'm very glad you came," the girl said, "even if it would be nice to sleep in a cherry tree. It's wonderful I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody, not really." The girl kept talking as they drove down the main road. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. "I've always heard that Prince Edward Island is the prettiest place in the world. I used to imagine living here, but I never expected I actually would. Am I talking too much?" she went on. "People always tell me I do. If you say so, I'll stop. I can stop, though it is difficult." Surprisingly, Matthew was enjoying himself. He'd never expected to enjoy the company of a young girl. He said shyly, "Oh, you can talk as much as you like. I don't mind." "I'm so glad. You and I will get along just fine. I feel nearly perfectly happy. I can't feel perfectly happy because, well, what color is this?" The girl held up one of her braids. "It's red, isn't it?" he said. "Yes, it's red," she said, sighing. "Now you see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody with red hair can be perfectly happy." "We're near home now," Matthew said uneasily. As they approached Green Gables, he did not think about Marilla or himself or the mistake. He thought only about the child's disappointment when she discovered the truth. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 2. Anne with an E. Marilla opened the door. She saw the odd girl in the ugly dress with long red braids and big eyes. "Matthew Cuthbert, who's that?" she said. "Where's the boy?" "There wasn't any boy," said Matthew slowly. "There was only her." He nodded at the child. He realized he didn't even know her name. "No boy? But there must be a boy," insisted Marilla. "We asked Mrs. Spencer for a boy." "Well, I asked the station master and Mrs. Spencer didn't bring a boy," said Matthew. "I had to bring the girl home." "Well, what do we do now?" asked Marilla. During this conversation the child was silent. Suddenly she understood what was happening. "You don't want me," she cried. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy. I should have known. Nobody ever did want me." She burst into tears. Neither Marilla nor Matthew knew what to do. Finally, Marilla said, "Well, well, there's no need to cry. You can stay here until we find out what happened." "What's your name?" The child stopped crying and asked eagerly, "Will you please call me Cordelia?" "Call you Cordelia? Is that your name?" asked Marilla. "No, it's not exactly my name, but I would love to be called Cordelia. It's a beautiful name." "I don't know what you mean. If Cordelia isn't your name, what is?" Marilla asked. "Anne Shirley," the girl answered. "But Anne is such an unromantic name." "Anne is a good, plain, sensible name," said Marilla. "It's all right, but I like Cordelia better. If you must call me Anne, please call me Anne spelled with an E," Anne said. "What does it matter how it's spelled?" asked Marilla, trying to stop a smile. "Oh, it looks so much nicer. ANN looks horrible, but ANNE looks more distinguished." "Did Mrs. Spencer bring any other orphans besides you?" Marilla inquired. "She brought Lily Jones for herself," Anne answered. "Lily is only 5 years old and she is very beautiful. She has nut brown hair. If I were very beautiful and had nut brown hair, would you keep me?" "No, we want a boy to help Matthew on the farm. A girl is no use. Now, take off your hat and let's eat dinner." Anne took off her hat and they sat down to eat. But Anne could not eat. She nibbled at the bread and butter and nibbled at the apple pie. When dinner was finished, Marilla showed Anne to a spare bedroom. Anne got into bed and put her head right under the covers. "Good night," Marilla said a little awkwardly, but kindly. Suddenly Anne's head reappeared. "How can you say it's a good night when you know it's the worst night I've ever had?" she cried. She disappeared under the covers again. Marilla went into the kitchen and started to wash the dishes. Matthew sat on a chair, saying nothing. "One of us will have to take the girl back tomorrow," said Marilla. "I suppose so," said Matthew reluctantly. "You suppose so?" Marilla echoed. "Don't you know so?" "Well, now, she's a real nice little thing, Marilla. It's a pity to send her back. She likes it so much here," said Matthew. "Matthew Cuthbert, do you really think we should keep her?" said Marilla, astonished. "Well, no, not exactly," stammered Matthew. "Of course we cannot keep her," said Marilla. "What good would she be to us?" "We might be some good to her," said Matthew unexpectedly. "Matthew Cuthbert, I can see that you want to keep her. That girl has bewitched you." "Well, now, she's a real interesting little thing," said Matthew. "You should have heard her talk, coming from the station." "Oh, she can talk all right. I don't like children that talk so much. I don't want an orphan girl, and if I did, it wouldn't be her." The next morning Anne awoke and sat up in bed. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. First she had a delightful thrill, and then a horrible memory. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. She got dressed and went downstairs for breakfast. "I'm pretty hungry this morning," she announced. "I'm glad it's such a sunny morning, but I like rainy mornings as well. All sorts of mornings are interesting, don't you think? You don't know what's going to happen throughout the day. Anything could happen." "For goodness sake, be quiet," said Marilla. Anne obeyed and was so silent that it made Marilla nervous. Matthew was also quiet, but this was natural, so the meal was a very silent one. After breakfast Anne washed the dishes, and then Marilla told her to go and play outside. Anne ran to the door, excited. Then she stopped suddenly, came back, and sat at the table. "What's the matter now?" said Marilla. "I can't go out," said Anne. "It's no use loving Green Gables. If I go out and meet all those trees and flowers, it'll just be harder to leave." Marilla thought, "In all my life I never saw or heard anything like it. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I am already wondering what she'll say next." But when evening came, Marilla and Anne got in the buggy and left Green Gables. They were on their way to Mrs. Spencer's house. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 3. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. "I decided to enjoy this drive," Anne said to Marilla on the way to Mrs. Spencer's house. "I learned you can nearly always enjoy something if you try hard. I'm not going to think about going back to the orphanage. I'm just going to think about the drive. Oh, look, there's a wild rose," she went on. "Isn't it lovely? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? And isn't pink the most bewitching color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Red-headed people can't wear pink." "Do you know anybody whose hair color changed when they grew up?" "No," said Marilla wearily, "and I don't think your hair color will change either." "Well, that's another hope gone. My life is a graveyard of buried hopes. That's a sentence I read in a book once. I say it to comfort myself when I'm disappointed." "How does it comfort you?" asked Marilla, surprised. "Why, because it sounds so nice and romantic, as if I were a heroine in a book." "If you're going to keep talking, you should tell me something about yourself," said Marilla. "Can I make it up?" Anne asked. "It'll be much more interesting." "No, I don't want any stories. Just stick to the facts. Where were you born? "And how old are you?" asked Marilla sternly. "I was 11 last March," said Anne, "and I was born in Nova Scotia. My father and mother were both high school teachers. They were very poor and lived in a tiny yellow house. I was born in that house. Mrs. Thomas said I was an ugly baby, scrawny and thin, but that my mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. She died of fever when I was only 3 months old, and soon after my father died from fever too. So I was an orphan and nobody knew what to do with me. Father and mother had both come from places far away and had no relatives around. Finally, Mrs. Thomas took me in, even though she was poor and her husband was a drunk. I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I helped look after the children, and it was hard work. Then Mr. Thomas was killed when he fell under a train. After that, I lived with the Hammonds, who had 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I like babies, but twins 3 times is too much. I got so tired carrying them around. I lived with the Hammonds for 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died. I had to go to the orphanage because the Hammonds didn't want me any longer either. It was too crowded in their house." "Did you ever go to school?" Marilla asked. "A little bit," answered Anne. "I can read well, and I know lots of poetry. Don't you just love poetry?" "Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" asked Marilla, looking at Anne carefully. Stammered Anne, blushing with embarrassment. "They tried to be good to me. I'm sure they meant to be good." Marilla asked no more questions. She suddenly felt pity for Anne, who hadn't had much love in her short life. Soon they arrived at Mrs. Spencer's house. "Well," Mrs. Spencer exclaimed, "you're the last folks I expected. How are you, Anne?" "All right," said Anne without smiling. "Mrs. Spencer," began Marilla, "I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake. We told the orphanage we wanted a boy." "Oh," Mrs. Spencer said. "That's too bad. I'm very sorry." "I'm sorry too," said Marilla. "Can we send the child back? The orphanage will take her, won't they?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully. "But wait a minute. Mrs. Blewett was here yesterday. She told me she would like a little girl." Marilla was not very pleased to hear this. Mrs. Blewett had a terrible temper and did not treat servant girls well. "Look, there's Mrs. Blewett now," said Mrs. Spencer. A thin-faced, frowning woman came over to the house. "How lucky! She can take Anne now." Mrs. Spencer explained the mistake to Mrs. Blewett. Mrs. Blewett looked Anne over from head to toe. "How old are you and what's your name?" she demanded. "My name is Anne Shirley, and I'm 11 years old," Anne replied. "You're too thin, that you're wiry," snapped Mrs. Blewett. "The wiry ones are the best. You'll be a good girl and work hard." "All right, Miss Cuthbert," she said to Marilla. "I'll take her home now." "I don't know," Marilla said slowly. "Matthew and I haven't decided what to do yet. If we decide not to keep Anne, I'll send her over tomorrow." "All right," said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. At Marilla's words, Anne's eyes grew bright like stars. "Can I really stay at Green Gables?" she whispered to Marilla. "We'll decide tonight," said Marilla crossly. "But you heard me. You might go to Mrs. Blewett. She needs you more than Matthew and I do." "Oh, send me to the orphanage instead. Mrs. Blewett looks like a monster," said Anne. "Anne Shirley, don't talk like that," Marilla scolded. "Go and sit quietly and be a good girl." "I'll be anything you want if you will keep me," pleaded Anne. Later, Marilla told Matthew about Anne's history and the trip to Mrs. Spencer's house. "I wouldn't give a dog to Mrs. Blewett," said Matthew. "I don't like Mrs. Blewett's style either," admitted Marilla. "Since you want to keep the girl, I suppose she can stay. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl. I'll probably make a mess of it, but I'll do my best." Matthew's shy face glowed with delight. Marilla, I hoped you would change your mind. She's such an interesting little thing. Yes, well, don't interfere, Matthew, Marilla said. I won't tell Anne tonight because she'll be so excited she won't sleep. An old maid might not know much about raising children, but neither does an old bachelor. Goodness knows what will come of it. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 4. Good News for Anne. Marilla had decided to keep Anne, but she didn't want to tell Anne until the next day. She took Anne upstairs and said, "Now, Anne, I noticed you threw all your clothes on the floor. That's a bad habit. Please fold your clothes and put them on the chair." "I was so upset last night I forgot," said Anne. "I'll fold them nicely tonight." "Say your prayers and get into bed." "I never say any prayers," announced Anne. Marilla was horrified. "What do you mean? Were you never taught to say prayers?" "Well, Mrs. Thomas told me that God made my hair red on purpose, so I don't really care for God. Anyway, I'm always too tired to say prayers." "Well, you must say your prayers here," Marilla insisted. "Of course I will," said Anne cheerfully. "I'm ready. What do I say?" "Just thank God and ask for some things you want," Marilla told Anne. "I'll do my best," promised Anne. "Dear God, thank you for the wild cherry tree in the lake, which I call the Lake of Shining Waters. I want so many things that it'll take a long time to say everything. So the most important things are these. Please let me stay at Green Gables, and please make me pretty when I grow up." Marilla waited until the next afternoon to tell Anne she could stay. During the morning Marilla asked Anne to do various tasks, and she watched Anne with a keen eye. By noon Marilla saw that Anne was a hard worker, quick to learn, clever, and obedient. Her most serious shortcoming was a tendency to start daydreaming in the middle of a task and forget everything until Marilla reprimanded her. When Anne finished washing dishes, she suddenly grabbed Marilla. "Oh, please, Miss Cuthbert, can you tell me if I can stay or not? I've tried to be patient all morning. Please tell me." "You haven't rinsed the dishcloth in boiling water, Anne," said Marilla. "Do that first." Anne attended to the dishcloth and then looked at Marilla again. "Well," said Marilla, "Matthew and I decided to keep you, if you are a good girl." "Anne, what's the matter?" "I'm crying," said Anne, "but I don't know why. I'm so happy. Oh, happy isn't the right word. I was happy to see the trees and flowers, but this, I'll try to be so good. Mrs. Thomas said I am wicked, so it will be difficult, but I'll try. But why am I crying, Marilla?" "I suppose because you're excited and worked up," said Marilla disapprovingly. "Sit down on that chair. Try to calm down. You laugh and cry far too easily. Now, you must go to school when it starts in September. Until then, you can help me here." "What will I call you? Miss Cuthbert? Aunt Marilla?" "No, just Marilla. I'm not used to Miss Cuthbert. Just plain Marilla is fine." "It sounds awfully disrespectful to say just Marilla," protested Anne. "Everybody else does. Make sure you speak politely and it will be fine," Marilla replied. "I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla," said Anne. "I've never had an aunt or any relation at all, not even a grandmother. Please?" "No, you can't. I don't believe in calling people names that don't belong to them." "But we could imagine you're my aunt." "I couldn't," said Marilla grimly. "Do you ever imagine things different from what they really are, Marilla?" asked Anne, wide-eyed. "No," said Marilla. "Oh!" Anne drew a long breath. Then she spoke. "Oh, Marilla, how much you miss!" Later Anne asked, "Marilla, Do you think I will ever have a kindred spirit in Avonlea? A, a what? Asked Marilla. A kindred spirit, a best friend in whom I can confide my innermost soul. I've dreamed of meeting her all my life. I never really supposed I would, but so many of my dreams have come true all at once that perhaps this one will too. Do you think it's possible? Diana Barry lives nearby and she's about your age, Marilla replied. She's a very nice girl, and perhaps she can be your playmate when she comes home. She's visiting her aunt now. You'll have to be careful how you behave, though. Mrs. Barry is very particular. She won't let Diana play with any girl who isn't nice and good. What is Diana like? Anne asked. Her hair isn't red, is it? Oh, I hope not. It's bad enough to have red hair myself, but I positively couldn't endure it in a best friend, too. Diana is a very pretty girl, said Marilla. She has black eyes and hair and rosy cheeks, and she is good and smart, which is better than being pretty. I'm so glad she's pretty, Anne said. I'm not beautiful, so having a beautiful friend would be wonderful. When I lived with Mrs. Thomas, there was a bookcase with glass doors. One of the doors was broken because Mr. Thomas smashed it when he was drunk. The other glass door was whole. I used to pretend that my reflection was another little girl who lived in the glass. Her name was Katie, and we were very close. I told her everything. Katie was my only friend. We pretended that the bookcase was enchanted. I knew the spell that took me to Katie's world. In Katie's world, there were flowers and fairies and sunshine, and we would live there happily ever after. When I went to live with Mrs. Hammond, I was so upset to leave Katie. She was sad too. Marilla listened and then gave Anne a strange look. I don't approve of such things, Anne. You seem to half believe your own imagination. Don't let Mrs. Barry hear you talking about your friend Katie. She'll think you're strange. Oh, I won't, said Anne. I won't tell anybody, but I thought you'd like to know. Well, Marilla said, smiling, you'll have a real friend soon, Anne. Look, there's a big bee in that apple blossom, said Anne. If I wasn't human, I think I'd like to be a bee and live in the flowers. Yesterday you wanted to be a bird, said Marilla. You are very fickle. Now, just be quiet for a minute. It seems impossible for you to stop talking if you've got anybody who will listen to you.